Have you ever felt that the ground of Europe holds more memories than books tell? As if ancient stones were silently watching, waiting for someone to ask. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is exactly what your soul needed to hear now in this present moment. Before empires, borders, and crowns, there were forgotten human steps, voices buried by time. Modern Europe was born on ancient layers, like a city built on invisible ruins. What we call the beginning is perhaps just continuation, a distant echo of something much older than we imagine together today. Thousands of years ago, hands we don't know raised colossal stones, carved symbols, and aligned structures to the sky. They left no names, only marks, brands that defy official dates and whisper that European history began long before that we learned in traditional school, accepted, repeated by entire silent generations. This video is not about denying science nor creating fantasies. It's about looking carefully, unite archaeology, genetics, and spiritual memory. It's about allowing honest doubt, why sometimes what was buried did not disappear, just waited for the right moment to be remembered by humanity once again, whole now. Underneath forests, cities, and roads, there are tunnels, megaliths, and foundations that cannot be matched the official chronology. Each uncomfortable discovery was labeled as exception, but repeated exceptions are not accidents. These are signs of a more deep, systematically ignored by generations, institutions, dogmas, power, fear, silence, oblivion, control, narrative. When a civilization falls, not everything turns to dust. Part of it is hidden, like seeds in the winter. Europe inherited languages, symbols, and knowledge that were not born there. He inherited it without remembering. And he built his identity on this oblivion, calling it progress, that which was the unconscious reuse of old, deep, forgotten, collective. Maybe that's why certain stories cause resistance. They deal with power, faith, and control. Revealing an older past requires humility. It requires admitting that we were not the first, only continuators. This idea scares systems, but it comforts the soul, because it expands our belonging in human time. Ancestral, continuous, alive, awake, shared. As you listen, perhaps something silent moves within you. A feeling of recognition, how to remember something never consciously experienced. If this happens, remain. It's no coincidence. What is hidden beneath Europe also lies inside human memory, waiting to be accessed again, now, together, deeply, today. In this initial portal, I do not offer closed answers. I offer questions. We will walk through ruins, myths, and science with respect and courage. If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer you seek may not be outside, but beneath layers forgotten about history, the earth, the human soul. Because what was buried is not always dead. Sometimes he just sleeps. And when we wake up to listen, the past stops being the past. He becomes a mirror. An ancient, deep, and uncomfortable mirror, reflecting who we are and where we really come from. We came as civilization, consciousness, journey, collective, continues, now, here. Take a deep breath. This is just the beginning. The layers we will see challenge comfort and expand awareness. Nothing here requires blind belief, just presence. The invitation is made. Walk with me through the shadows of European time, where ancient truths await eyes willing to see beyond the obvious, historical, official, imposed, repeated, automatically. What if, at the end of this journey, you realize that Europe didn't start where they said, that your true story pulses beneath layers of oblivion? So this video will have fulfilled its role, open a crack, because remembering is not going back. It's finally following forward, conscious, awake, whole, present, human, ancestral. Before Rome built its roads, before Greece named philosophy, before any map called this territory Europe, there were already people here. People who watched the sky. He understood cycles, moved impossible stones, and left deep marks on the landscape. A official history begins too late, as if the continent had just awakened when he started writing about himself. When we look back more carefully, we notice a strange void between the emergence of European Homo sapiens and classical civilizations. Thousands of years treated as silence. But silence is not absence. It's just a lack of listening. And the land European speaks. She speaks through megaliths, astronomical alignments and structures that do not fit into the traditional script of human progress. Long before Athens and Rome, organized communities already inhabited the continent. People who did not leave books, but left piedras, stones aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and specific stars. This is no coincidence. Requires prolonged observation, knowledge, transmitted through generations, and a deep relationship between heaven, earth, and human consciousness. Prehistoric Europe was not primitive in the simplistic sense we have been taught. It was different. Their knowledge was not expressed in expansive empires, but in integration with the environment. Time was circular, not linear. The memory was alive, transmitted by rituals, symbols, and sacred landscapes. When we judge these cultures as backward, we reveal more about our own forgetfulness than about them. Modern excavations continue to reveal sophisticated settlements dating back to thousands of years before classical civilizations. Planned structures, systems of drainage, geometric patterns, and complex symbolic art. Still, these discoveries rarely receive the same prominence as Greek columns or Rhodes Romans. They disrupt the comfortable narrative of clear and linear origin. There is a silent discomfort in admitting that Europe inherited more than it created. What its cultural foundations rest on ancient layers of forgotten peoples. Except, this requires reviewing the idea of civilizational superiority. It requires recognizing that knowledge, human, not only evolves forward, but also gets lost, fragments, and reappears in new forms. The so-called European Stone Age was anything but simple. Refined tools, art symbolic, ritualized burials, and social organization indicate psychological depth and spiritual. These people thought about death, the cosmos, and the human place in the universe. They were not brute survivors. They were attentive observers of reality, internal and external. Perhaps the biggest mistake was confusing the absence of writing with the absence of intelligence. A fixed writing, but also limits. Before her, knowledge flowed in living narratives, shared experiences, and natural symbols. The forest, the mountain, and the sky were books open. When writing arrived, it brought back memory, but it also erased the value of what it could not be recorded in words. By saying that Europe began with Greece and Rome, we ignore millennia of preparation human, as if the continent had been an empty stage awaiting protagonists' classics. But the stage was already built. The foundations already existed. What came next simply reused, reinterpreted, and often deliberately deleted what was not. It matched his self-image. If you feel a slight discomfort when you hear this, it's natural. Questioning origins affects identity. But perhaps Europe was never a beginning. Maybe it always was a crossroads, a territory where ancient knowledge converged, were transformed and moved forward with new names and new masks. Understanding Europe before Europe does not diminish what came after. Zoom in, give depth. It shows that human history is longer, richer, and more mysterious than what simplified timelines. And it sets the stage for something even more unsettling. That which is not just in the past, but hidden beneath our feet. There are stories that do not disappear by chance. They are removed, erased layer by layer, like symbols scraped from an ancient stone. Europe carries this type of silence, a heavy, constructed silence, because before the people we learned to call founders, there were entire cultures that did not fit the model winner of history. These cultures didn't just lose wars, they lost the right to be remembered. Their names were dissolved, their practices demonized, their symbols reinterpreted or destroyed. What remained were fragments, stones without authorship, myths treated as fantasy, ruins attributed to unknown peoples. A convenient label not to delve deeper into uncomfortable questions. When empires expand, they don't just dominate territories, they dominate narratives. They decide who came before, who deserves continuity, and who should be forgotten. In Europe, this process happened repeatedly. Megalithic people, ancient maritime cultures, sophisticated agricultural societies were swallowed by waves. Successive cultural and religious conquests. Many of these people lived in deep connection with natural cycles. Your spirituality, it was not centered on monumental temples, but on the living landscape. Forests, hills, caves, and rivers were considered portals of meaning. When new religions arrived, These practices were labeled as pagan, dangerous, primitive, the elimination. It wasn't just physics, it was symbolic. Destroying symbols is an effective form of control. When you erase the language, spirituality of a people also erases their collective memory. In Europe, numerous places, ancient sacred buildings were transformed into churches, castles, or simply buried, not as a tribute, but as a replacement, a new layer over the old one, without dialogue, without recognition. But the erasure is never complete. He leaves traces, and these traces continue appearing where least expected. Artifacts out of context, dates that don't match, cultural patterns that reappear in distant regions, without clear explanation. The story official calls it a coincidence, but constant coincidences reveal hidden systems. There are prehistoric European cultures that demonstrated advanced knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and engineering. They do not fit the image of the savage primitive. On the contrary, reveal complex social organization, division of functions, and vision long-term. Even so, they are treated as footnotes, when they should occupy entire chapters. Part of this erasure also came from fear. Fear of the sacred feminine, of knowledge transmitted by oral lineages, of spiritual autonomy. Many of these cultures were less hierarchical, more circular. Power was not concentrated. It represented a direct threat to centralized systems that would emerge later. For control, it was necessary to discredit. What we call ancient European mythology today is often fragmented history. Gods transformed into monsters, erased heroines, rituals reduced to folklore. When we look carefully, we realize that these myths carry codes of cultural memory. They speak of cataclysms, migrations, lost knowledge, and profound transformations of humanity. These cultures did not disappear because they were weak. Many were assimilated. Your descendants remained alive but disconnected from their origin. The blood followed, but the memory was cut off. This creates a strange feeling of identity emptiness. How if something was missing, but we didn't know what? A longing without an object. Modern. European history was constructed as a straight line. Greece, Rome, Age Middle, Renaissance. Clean. Organized. But this line only exists because others were erased. Older, curved, circular, deep lines. Lines that spoke of continuity with the land, not dominion over it. Recognizing erased cultures is not romanticizing the past. It's restoring complexity. It is accept that human history is not just made up of enlightened winners, but of multiple intelligences coexisting. Some survived. Others were silenced. But all left marks on the European collective unconscious. Maybe that's why certain places cause inexplicable sensations. A shiver upon entering an ancient forest. A heavy silence over specific hills. A feeling of reverence without knowing why. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten. The earth holds that the books omitted. When talking about erased cultures, we touch on something sensitive. Because remembering is an act political, spiritual, and human. And the closer we get to these buried memories, the more we realize that they are not just in the distant past. They continue pulsing beneath our feet, literally. And that's exactly where our journey deepens. Because some of these cultures they left only traces on the surface. They left marks underground, tunnels, chambers, hidden cities, structures that should not exist according to the official narrative, structures that force us to look down and question everything again. There is a second European continent that almost no one sees. It doesn't appear on maps, it does not receive tourists, and is rarely mentioned in books. Still, it exists. One underground world of tunnels, chambers, buried cities, and structures that defy simple explanations. When we look at Europe just from the surface, we see history. When we look down, we find something more unsettling: intention. Under medieval villages, modern capitals, and silent countryside, there are passages excavated long before the Europe we know. Some were reused, others sealed, others forgotten. Many do not have clear records of origin. It is not known exactly who built them, when or why. And perhaps this is the most disturbing. No one seems to be in a hurry to find out. Natural caves have always existed. But what we find beneath Europe goes beyond the natural. Straight tunnels, smooth walls, precise angles, ventilation systems and chambers interconnected suggest engineering, not chance. In some cases, these structures cross kilometers, connecting entire regions as if they were part of a network planned. In different European countries, similar reports emerge independently. Discoveries made during construction work, agricultural excavations, or geographical accidents reveal ancient corridors not recorded in any known historical record. Often, upon discovery, access is quickly closed, classified, silenced. The public move on, no questions asked. Why would anyone build so extensively underground? The most common explanation says, in refuge, escape, protection against invasion. But this answer doesn't explain everything. The scale is big, too much. The complexity is excessive. There are places where the passages are high, wide, and elaborate, suggesting frequent use, not just temporary shelter. Some of these structures appear older than the cities they rest on today about them, as if the surface had been occupied later, without full knowledge of the that already existed below. This reverses our perception of progress. Maybe the underground was a response to danger. Maybe it was the starting point. The underground has always carried deep symbolism, represents the invisible, the hidden, the unconscious. For many ancient cultures, going down was as sacred as going up. The sky offered guidance. The earth, transformation. Building below was not a sign of fear, but of reverence, a space reserved for what should not be seen by everyone. There are tunnels that appear to align with specific points on the surface, sacred hills, ancient ritual centers, energetic intersections of the landscape. None of this is confirmed officially, but the patterns are repeated with enough insistence to be annoying. Where there is repetition, there is intention. Where there is intention, there is knowledge. In some cases, the European underground reveals signs of continuous use over a period of time. Different eras. Later cultures entered these spaces, adapted, modified, reused. But they were rarely the original builders. It's as if they had inherited something they did not fully understand, but recognized as powerful too much to destroy. The institutional silence around these structures is curious. It's not just about lack of resources or interest. In certain cases, there is active resistance, incomplete reports, restricted access, vague language, as if the underground carries questions that are not must be done out loud, perhaps because it challenges the linear narrative of human development. If there were societies capable of planning and excavating vast underground systems in times remote, then our understanding of technological capability, social organization, and spiritual purpose needs to be reviewed, and profound revisions threaten certainties consolidated. What hides beneath Europe is not just stone, it's memory, a memory that doesn't easily fit into dates or academic categories, a memory that suggests that our ancestors thought on larger scales, both in space and time, what they planned, not just for a generation but for entire cycles of existence. There is also something more subtle. Many people who enter these spaces report sensations strange, a dense silence, a change in perception, as if the air were different. This can be explained psychologically, but when the same story is repeated in different places distinct, the question arises, were these spaces designed to provoke something specific to humans? Maybe the underground wasn't just functional. Maybe he was initiatory, a place of passage, of symbolic death and rebirth, descend and then emerge transformed. This idea runs through ancient European myths, folktales, and spiritual traditions. Forgotten, the hero always descends before returning to the light. If this is true, then part of European history did not happen under the sun, but in controlled darkness, in hallways where light was rare but the purpose was clear, places where knowledge was transmitted selectively, away from the common eye, no to control, but to preserve. Today we walk through these spaces without knowing it. We drove over old tunnels. We build houses over forgotten chambers. And maybe that's why there is a feeling diffuse disconnection. How to live about something we don't recognize. How to inherit one home without knowing that there is a basement full of untold stories. What hides beneath Europe requires no belief. It requires curiosity, requires humility faced with the unknown. Because looking down is admitting that the surface doesn't tell everything, that there are layers. There always has been, and that some truths were not lost, just buried, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And the closer we get to these hidden layers, the more a question arises, inevitable. If there is so much effort to hide, seal, or ignore this underground past, what exactly are we afraid of remembering? Every civilization chooses what to remember, but most importantly, choose what forget. Forgetting is rarely accidental. It is cultivated, repeated, taught. In Europe, the fear of ancient memory runs through centuries like an invisible thread, linking power, religion, and identity. It's not just ignorance, it's defense. Remembering too much can be destabilizing, can question hierarchies, expose continuities, inconveniences, and reveal that many certainties are recent. Deep memory threatens pure origin narratives. It suggests mixing, inheritance, and dependence for systems that, if they are legitimized by the idea of an absolute beginning, this is dangerous. When ancient European spiritual practices were labeled as superstition, they did not treat the pains to correct errors. It was about replacing meanings. The sacred was centralized, standardized, domesticated. What once lived in the landscape, in the body, and in the cycle was confined to institutions. Remembering what came before would weaken this centralization. The fear of memory is also the fear of chaos. The official history offers order, dates, names, causes, and effects. Ancestral memory is less obedient. It appears in fragments, sensations, myths, places. It doesn't fit well in straight lines. For to manage it, it was necessary to simplify, reduce, classify. Throughout European history, whenever something old emerged out of control, the reaction it was fast. Reformulate, reinterpret, neutralize. Ancient gods became saints. Locations sacred became buildings of another faith. Oral traditions were replaced by texts authorized. Thus, the memory was recycled without being recognized. There is also the fear of recognizing losses. Admitting that knowledge has been forgotten implies accepting that progress is not constant, that there were regressions, that the past, it wasn't just ignorance waiting for enlightenment. For a civilization that builds itself as the apex of reason, this is a blow to pride. Modern science, despite its achievements, also inherited this fear. Everything that does not fit easily into current methods is treated with excessive caution or discarded, not because of a lack of rigor but because of discomfort. Why accept certain possibilities would require reopening questions considered closed. But the memory doesn't disappear. She moves. It lives in folklore, in children's tales, in regional festivals, superstitions. Lives in old words that we no longer know how to translate completely. It lives in the body, in inexplicable reactions to certain places. The fear of memory does not eliminate it. It just pushes her into the shadows. There is also a more intimate fear, that we are not as separate from the past as we are. We like to think. Recognizing continuities forces us to take responsibility. See, we inherit, we also carry. If we are continuity, we cannot just blame the ancients or the primitives. Memory connects. At many times in European history, remembering was treated as heresy. Question official versions became a threat. The deep past has become dangerous, reserved territory to a few experts, or pushed into fiction. Thus, the common citizen was trained to don't ask, to be accepted. Next, this training is effective. It creates comfort, but it also creates emptiness, a void that manifests as disconnection, as an incessant search for identity, as a feeling of that something essential has been lost. The fear of memory takes its toll. It impoverishes the human experience. There is a paradox in all this. Europe values museums, ruins, and heritage, but you prefer a framed, domesticated, distant past, a past that can be visited, photographed, and left behind. What scares is the living past, the one who still talks, which still influences. Maybe that's why there is so much resistance when discoveries suggest cultural continuity, deep or unexpected ancient technologies. It's not just about reviewing dates. It's about admitting that our ancestors knew things that we have forgotten, and that it inverts the logic of temporal superiority. The fear of memory is deep down a fear of humility. Humility to recognize that no, we started everything, that we learn, inherit, copy, adapt, that we are part of a long human chain, neither better nor worse. Just one more link. When the memory returns, it does not ask for permission. It arises in questions, in discoveries, in discomforts. And every time we try to silence her, she finds another crack, another tunnel, another story. Because memory, like the earth, keeps. And what is stored tends to emerge. Perhaps the greatest fear is not what memory reveals about the past, but what it reveals about us now. About our choices, our omissions, and our fragile certainties. Remembering takes courage, but forgetting indefinitely is impossible. And when memory begins to awaken, it doesn't come alone. It has a consequence inevitable. The need to reposition identity. To realize that Europe is not isolated origin, but heir, and heirs need to learn to listen before asserting. There is an idea deeply rooted in European consciousness, that of origin. The notion that modern Europe was born of itself, from a unique awakening of reason, art, and science. But when we look honestly at the previous layers, this idea begins to dissolve. What emerges in its place is not loss, but maturity. Europe. It is not absolute origin. She's an heiress. Being an heir is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of continuity. Every solid civilization builds on something that came before. The problem arises when inheritance is denied, when the heir comes to believe that he alone created what he only received, transformed or reorganized. This illusion generates pride, but also historical blindness. Europe, he learned ancient knowledge through multiple paths. Migrations, cultural exchanges, silent survivals. Knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy, and social organization did not emerge out of nowhere. They were adapted, refined, renamed, often without recognition of the original sources. The inheritance was incorporated, but the credit, deleted. Modern genetics confirms what archaeology already suspected. European peoples' current cultures carry diverse lineages, intertwined over millennia. There is no purity original. There is constant mixing. Each human wave brought something new and took something old. European identity is a mosaic, not a statue carved in one fell swoop. When we accept Europe as heir, we better understand its paradoxes. A coexistence of rationality and myth, of science and spirituality, of order and creative chaos. These contrasts are not flaws. These are traces of multiple heritages coexisting in the same cultural space. Some recognized, others repressed. The Renaissance, for example, was not born out of nowhere. It was a rediscovery. One selective return to ancient knowledge that had been preserved often outside the Europe during periods of internal oblivion. This in itself reveals dependence. It reveals that the flow of knowledge does not respect borders or narratives of superiority. Recognizing heritage also changes our relationship with time. The story stops being a ladder of inevitable progress and becomes a field of losses and reunions. Some things move forward, others are lost. Others return, transformed. This vision is less comfortable but more human. There is something liberating about letting go of the obsession with origin. It holds us to the idea of perfect start. Inheritance, on the contrary, connects us to responsibility. What we do, what do we receive? What do we choose to preserve? What we let disappear again? These questions are more relevant than who arrived first. Modern Europe, seeing itself as heir, can finally dialogue with its past deep without fear, can recognize erased cultures without guilt, can integrate underground memories without identity collapse. Because inheriting doesn't diminish. Zoom in, give context, gives depth. This change in perspective also impacts spirituality. Instead of rupture, there is continuity. Instead of denial, there is transformation. Ancient symbols reappear beneath new forms. Ancient rituals survive in everyday gestures. The sacred does not disappear. It just changed language. Perhaps this is why so many Europeans feel a diffuse search for meaning, an attraction inexplicable by ancient ruins, forgotten myths, alternative spiritual paths. It's not fashion. It's memory trying to reorganize itself. It's the heritage asking for recognition conscious. Heritage also explains the discomfort faced with certain archaeological discoveries. They don't just threaten theories. They threaten identities based on exclusivity. Admit inheritance is to admit interdependence. It is to recognize that no civilization walks alone. When Europe positions itself as heir, it can finally occupy a more honest in human history. Neither absolute center nor late appendage, but link. A link which received, transformed, and transmitted. A link responsible for what he chose to forget and from what he can still remember. This memory does not require a return to the past, requires integration. Look back without idealize, without demonizing. Just acknowledge, because only those who recognize the inheritance can consciously decide what to do with it. And perhaps the biggest challenge is not accepting what Europe inherited, but accept that this heritage still lives. It still influences. It still pulses beneath the surface of cities, ideas, and of people. And when this pulse is ignored, it manifests as emptiness. When is welcomed, it transforms into wisdom. Recognizing oneself as an heir is the necessary step before the final awakening, because only after accepting where we came from, we can decide, clearly, where we really want to go. There is a moment in every journey when something silently changes. It's not a revelation explosive nor a definitive answer. It's an internal displacement, a feeling that what seemed distant begins to get closer. The memory does not arrive as a fact new, but like something old that finally finds space to emerge. When deep memory awakens, it does not speak of dates. She talks about sensations, one sudden recognition, an unexplained shiver, an interest that appears out of nowhere for ruins, symbols, forgotten stories, not because they are exotic, but because they sound family members, like listening to a language you don't speak but understand. This memory does not just belong to Europe as a territory. It goes through whoever lives there today, without even knowing it. It's in the bodies, in the choices, in the silences. You are attracted to certain places, in the inexplicable melancholy of some landscapes, in the constant search for something that always seems to be missing, even in the midst of progress. Maybe because remembering is not just about accumulating information. Remembering is integrating. It's allowing that forgotten layers are part of who we are now. And that requires more than intellect. It requires internal listening, presence, courage to feel without needing to control immediately the meaning. The memory that awakens is also uncomfortable. She challenges rigid identities, question inherited certainties. Therefore, it is often rejected, labeled as nostalgia, fantasy, or irrelevance. But the more it is pushed away, the more it returns in other ways, because what is not integrated repeats itself. In a world saturated with information, deep remembering is subtle. She doesn't scream. She whispers. It appears in simple questions that insist, who were we before? What was lost? What still lives in us without a name? These questions don't seek answers quickly. They seek maturity. There is something deeply human about this process. Civilizations, as well as individuals, go through phases of forgetting and remembering. Childhood forgets. Maturity remembers. Perhaps we are living at a time when Europe and the world are beginning to look back not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, need for meaning, rooting, of reconnection, with something greater than narrative of consumption, speed, and separation. Remembrance offers depth. She remembers that we haven't started now, that we have been part of something in motion for a long time. When this memory approaches, a choice also arises. Ignore and follow as rather, or listen and allow it to transform the way we see the world. Listen, no, it means rejecting modernity. It means balancing it. Bring awareness where there was automatism. Maybe that's why so many people feel an inexplicable call for silence, for nature, for spirituality outside rigid structures. It's not an escape, it's a return not to literal past, but to a more complete relationship with existence, a relationship that recognizes cycles, limits, and continuity. The memory that awakens does not promise immediate comfort. She asks for responsibility. See, remember, we need to act differently. We need to take better care of we inherit, of the land, of culture, of relationships. Remembering is an ethical act, because the forgetfulness allows you to repeat mistakes without awareness. And there is something deeper still. When we remember as a collective, we heal internal fragmentations. The feeling of not belonging decreases. The void begins to make sense. Not because everything can be resolved, but because we understand where it comes from. The memory does not eliminate the pain. She contextualizes it. Maybe you feel that now, not as certainty, but as openness, an internal space that expands, a calm curiosity. If this happens, allow it. No need to define everything today. Memory works in layers. It reveals itself at the right time. This awakening is not about going back to who we were. It's about integrating who we were for become something more whole. History does not pull us back. She pushes us towards a more conscious front, if we accept to listen. And when that memory finds space, something quiets down, as if an old part said, finally you listened. Finally you realize that you can't walk alone in time, that carries voices, footsteps, and old dreams, not as weight, but as root. The memory that awakens does not end the journey. She deepens it, and prepare the ground for the final silence, that moment when there are no more explanations, just presence, just the essential question, suspended in the air, waiting for each person to answer their own way. We've reached the point where the words start to dwindle, not because there is no longer the what to say, but because some truths only reveal themselves in silence. After crossing layers of stone, memory, and oblivion, all that remains is the pause, the space between a question and another. Maybe now you realize that this journey was never just about Europe. It was about the human condition, about how civilizations like people forget to survive and remember to mature. What hides beneath Europe is the same as often hides within us. Unintegrated stories, buried memories, dormant potentials. Nothing seen here requires blind belief. It demands listening. It requires presence, requires the courage to admit that the past is not dead and that the present is just a layer in motion. When we accept this, something reorganizes. Time stops being the enemy and becomes silent master. Maybe you'll leave this video without any answers. This is intentional. Answers close. Lively questions accompany. They walk with you down the street, through work, through the silence of the night. They open up space for history to stop being something external and become a relationship. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Not out of habit, but by affinity. Because journeys like this don't happen alone. They are built on shared presence, step by step, layer by layer. And now before you go, allow one last moment of silence. Breathe. Feel the weight of the floor under your feet. Think of the countless generations that have walked before you. Not how distant ghosts, but part of the same flow. What if what we call the beginning is just the point where we forget? Maybe the future is to remember, integrate, and move forward with awareness. Now,